I am making a video today regarding Paul's epistles. I've been studying Paul's epistles recently, and I've come to notice that a lot of the language that Paul uses in his writings can be a bit confusing. I actually ran across a document that gives an explanation as to why these writings are so confusing in the New Testament. But first I wanted to bring attention to 2 Peter 3:16. Peter in the New Testament gives a warning about Paul's epistles, and in the verse he states, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. So Peter in this verse is giving a warning to those studying the Bible that Paul's epistles are hard to understand unless you are very learned in the scriptures. So I wanted to go over this document I found recently that gives an explanation as to why Paul's writings can be difficult to understand. So let me start by reading from the top, how to understand the differences between law in the New Testament. Starts off by saying, there is Ahiah's God's law he gave to Israel in Exodus, and there is the false law of the Pharisees, also known as the Talmud, that Messiah and the apostles spoke against. Do you understand how to know the difference? Now, the middle of the document gives 3 verses to illustrate this point that there is differences in the word law in the New Testament. The first 2 references are from Matthew 5:17 and Matthew 5:18. And in these 2 verses, you'll notice that the term the law is accompanied by 2 separate Strong's Concordance numbers, 3588 and 3551. So you can see that the has its own number and law has its own number. Now this is different than what we see in Romans 2:23. In 2:23, we see that in the first part of the verse, the law only has 1 Strong's Concordance number, 3551. And in the second half of the verse, you see that the term is split up again with 2 Strong's Concordance numbers. This is telling us that there are differences between the terms the law in the New Testament. And how we notice that there's a difference is by the Strong's Concordance numbers. So let me continue reading this document. In Matthew 5:17 and 5:18, the law has 2 Strong's Concordance numbers within the term the law. This document is stating that these 2 instances are referring to God's law, Ahiah's law known as the Torah, right? What we all understand the law to be. We understand that it's Ahiah, or the Most High God's law. The document, if we read further, referring to the first term, the law, which only has 1 Strong's Concordance number, this document is reporting that this is where the translators inserted some deception, right? So the first mention of the law only has 1 Strong's Concordance number. This term is the law that we know as the Talmud, or the oral traditional law practiced by the Pharisees. So this is where we can identify the difference between that type of law and Ahiah, the Most High's law, because of the Strong's Concordance numbers that are attached, right? So let me continue reading. Number 1, in Greek, all types of law use the same word, nomos, 3551, right? So we see that both of the terms have that 3551 Strong's number, and the difference is the additional word the 3588 to signify God's law, the Most High, Ahiah. Let's continue reading. Number 2, God's law, or the Torah, is preceded by the Greek article the, 3588, as we see here. So God's law, Torah's law, has the word the in front of it, and the Pharisees' law does not have 3588. Number 3, this gives an explanation of what's happening here. So the false Pharisee Judaism, Talmud, man-made law does not have the Greek article in front of it, but translators made mistakes and typed in the in front of law nomos and did not italicize it to show it so the reader would know it does not exist. This is why for centuries Paul's writings seem confusing, as sometimes Paul seems to be speaking highly of God's law, and at other times Paul appears to criticize God's law, but in reality, once you know Greek, you realize Paul never speaks against Torah's law or God's law. In fact, Acts 21:24 shows us that Paul lives by God's law, just like Messiah. So let's go to Acts 21:24 to see what they're talking about. I'm using the Blue Letter Bible. I'm looking at KJV, and it's referring to Acts 21:24. Them take and purify themselves with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, and keepest the law. So let's see what type of law Paul is talking about in Acts 21:24. By hitting the tools button, we'll see the verse broken down with the Strong's Concordance number right next to the word. So let's go down to the bottom of the verse. So we notice here that Paul is referring to God's law, or the Torah, and we know that because there are two separate concordance numbers within that term. So in this verse, Paul is talking about Torah, or the Most High Ahai's law. I have a couple of other examples. If we take Matthew 17 and 18, which was referenced in that document, if we look at Matthew 5:17, we notice that the law is used. Now let's just make sure and see what type of law they're talking about. Again, you see two strong concordance numbers, one for the word the and one for the word law. So this verse is referring to God's law, the Torah. Now let's go to Matthew 18, do the same thing for Matthew 18. One jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law. Again, we see two strong concordance numbers signifying that this is talking about the law. Now let's look at the Romans example, and that was Romans 2:23. Thou that makest thy boast of the law. And right here we notice that the law is only shown in one row, right? It's only associated with one Strong's Concordance number, 3551. So right here, Paul is talking about the law, which is not God's law, but is Pharisaical Talmudic law, the oral tradition at the time. So let's look at one more example. Romans 7:1 is a good example because you'll see both types of law being referred to within the same verse. Now this is one of those verses that can be confusing if you don't know about these two different uses of the term law. So in this verse, Paul is stating, "Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth." Let's click on tools and see what type of law we're talking about here. So, know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law. Again, quickly we notice here that the law is only one Strong's Concordance number. So Paul at the beginning here is talking about Pharisaical law. How that the law, and again, we notice here that this is different. The law is broken down into two words. So Paul is directly afterwards speaking about God's law and not Pharisaical law in the second half of that verse. Hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth, right? So this gives a lot of clarity to this verse. Knowing this gives us a lot of clarity already on how to distinguish what type of law Paul is speaking about in the epistles. Thank you for listening.